I have heard a good many stories about stubborn men, and the things that finally moved them. But, the one that stays with me longest happened in the Gallatin Valley in the autumn of 1891, on a homestead where the well had gone dry 3 seasons running and 3 separate men, with all the confidence of experience, had already failed to find a new one. Gideon Lark was 41 years old, and had not spoken more than a dozen sentences to any neighbor in the 2 years since his wife passed. Not out of grief exactly, or not only out of grief but out of the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that relying on anyone's word but his own had already cost him more than he was willing to pay twice. He had purchased his quarter section of Gallatin Valley land from a broker in Bozeman named Parsley, who had described the property as reliable, well-watered ground. That description turned out to mean the single well, already dug on the east corner, which produced good water for exactly 1 season, before the water table shifted, and left Gideon hauling water by barrel from the creek 2 miles south every 3 days through his 2nd summer, and every day through his 3rd. 3 men had tried to find him a new source. A dowser from Livingston who came with a forked willow branch and a voice full of certainty. A neighbor's hired hand who fancied himself knowledgeable about rock formations, and a well driller from Bozeman who charged Gideon $40 before admitting, after 2 dry holes, that the ground was unreadable to him. The creek haul continued. Adeline Cross had arrived in the county 6 weeks earlier with 2 trunks, a surveying kit, and the kind of direct gaze that made people look away first. She was 36 years old, a widow from Western Virginia, whose late husband had spent 20 years as a civil engineer building railroad bridges and teaching his wife, who had the sharper natural eye of the two, everything he knew about reading landscape, water table, and the slow logic of how land holds or loses what falls on it. She had come to Montana because her late husband's brother had offered her acreage adjacent to his own as part of the estate settlement. Land she intended to work herself, which the county had found variously admirable, peculiar, and frankly unlikely, depending on which neighbor you asked. She heard about Gideon Lark's water problem the same way anyone heard anything in the Gallatin Valley in 1891, through a single conversation at the dry goods store, that immediately became every conversation in the county for the following week. She rode over on a Tuesday morning in October, with the first real cold of the season sitting in the air, and the mountains already white above the tree line, and knocked on Gideon's door with the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who had already thought through what she was going to say, and did not expect it to be received well. She said she believed she could find him water. She had read the slope of his land from her own property, and had a theory about where the water table ran beneath the east quarter. She was willing to spend a day walking his ground to confirm it. Gideon looked at Adeline Cross for a long moment from the doorway of his house, and said that 3 men had already tried, and the last one had cost him $40 for 2 holes that held nothing but dry clay. He said it with the flat, conclusive tone of a man who had decided the subject was finished. Adeline said she was not those 3 men. She was not asking for $40, she was asking for 1 day. Gideon said that if she found water on his property, he would pay for the digging himself, and would furthermore buy whatever timber she needed for her first fence line, since he understood she was still getting started on her place, and if she didn't find it, he said, he would appreciate not hearing the subject raised again. He said it the way a man says something he is certain will settle the matter. Adeline said that was a fair wager, and that she would need to start at the north fence line and work south without an interruption. She had brought her own tools. Gideon said she was welcome to try and went back inside, where he could watch from the window and he reasoned, would not have to watch for long. To understand why Gideon doubted Adeline the way he did, you have to understand what the 3 previous failures had cost him beyond the $40. The well driller had come recommended as the best in the territory. The dowser had been vouched for by 2 neighbors who swore by him. The hired hand had looked at Gideon's ground with the particular authoritative squint of a man who had never once admitted ignorance, spent 40 minutes telling Gideon exactly where the water was, and drilled a hole that hit bedrock at 8 feet. Each man had arrived confident. Each man had left Gideon hauling water by barrel and trusting human judgment a little less than he had before. There was also the matter of Parsley the land broker, whose letter had described the property as featuring reliable, year-round water. Access, a phrase that had impressed Gideon enough that he had not asked follow-up questions before signing the deed. He had asked follow-up questions about everything since. Adeline did not begin where Gideon expected. She started at the north fence line as she had said, but instead of watching the ground, she spent the first 40 minutes watching the vegetation, which grasses grew tallest, where the cottonwood saplings had seated themselves along the low end of the slope, where the soil changed color near the base of a long, shallow rise on the eastern edge of the property. She walked slowly and stopped often, crouching down to press her palm flat against the earth, holding still in the way of a person who was not performing patience but actually practicing it. taking in something Gideon couldn't name from the window. He came out after an hour, stood at a distance, with his arms crossed, and said she had covered about a third of the property. Adeline said, without looking up from a stretch of darker grass along the slope's lower edge, that she knew. She said the ground told you where it held water if you knew how to ask it, and that asking took longer than telling. Gideon said that the well driller from Bozeman had also taken his time and produced 2 dry holes. Adeline said the well driller from Bozeman had been reading for where he preferred to dig, not for where the water preferred to run. There was a difference, she said, and it was the difference that mattered. Gideon found he did not have a ready answer for this. He went back to the fence line and stayed. His neighbor to the south, a weathered homesteader named Prescott, who had farmed the adjacent quarter for 11 years, had spotted Adeline's horse at Gideon's gate on his way to check his own fence line and stopped. Word about her offer had reached him the same morning it reached everyone else, and Prescott was not a man who passed up the chance to see how something unusual turned out. He leaned on the fence beside Gideon and watched Adeline work. After a long while he said that she wasn't walking the way the others had walked. Gideon said he had noticed. Prescott said the dowser had walked like a man listening for something. The well driller had walked like a man who already knew something. This woman, he said, was walking like someone reading something. He didn't know if it would amount to anything, but he'd never seen anyone approach the ground quite that way before. Gideon said nothing. He was watching Adeline crouch again at the base of the long slope, pressing both palms flat against the soil. This time her eyes closed, with the particular stillness of a person who had learned that the body could register things the eyes alone would miss. By midday she had circled back to the eastern quarter, and spent the better part of an hour around a stretch of ground 40 yards from the failed well, which had always struck Gideon as the least promising part of his property, sitting lower than the surrounding land, and prone to hardening into something close to clay, in dry years. But she kept returning to a particular stand of wild rye there, crouching, pressing, moving 6 inches, crouching again. She said, without turning, that he could come look if he wanted. He came and looked. She pointed to the darker earth beneath the rye, pressed her fingers into it, and showed him the moisture 3 inches down, different from the drier ground 6 feet away. She said the water was there, perhaps 20 feet down, fed by a seam that ran beneath the slope from the north. The seam was narrow, she said, which was why the dowser had missed it, and why the well driller's holes on the west side had come up dry. But it was consistent. It would not shift the way the original well had shifted, because it was fed from bedrock runoff rather than shallow table water. Gideon looked at the ground she was indicating, and said nothing for a moment. Prescott, who had drifted over without either of them quite noticing, said quietly that he didn't know if she was right, but that she was the first person he had watched walk that property, who looked like she actually understood what she was looking at. The others had all looked like men performing understanding. This was different. Gideon said, with considerably less conviction than he intended, that it was still only a theory until someone put a shovel in the ground. Adeline said that was true of most things worth knowing, and that she was prepared to be wrong. She had been wrong before and had learned more from those times than from the times she had been right. But she did not think she was wrong about this. She said it without drama, the way a person says something they simply believe to be true, without needing anyone else to believe it first. Gideon hired a digger from town the following morning. He did not tell the man who had identified the location. He gave him the spot marked with a short stake and said to start there. The water came in at 19 feet. Not a trickle, a genuine seam, cold and steady, that the digger said he hadn't seen the like of on any property he'd worked in the valley. He said whoever had picked the spot had known what they were looking at. Gideon paid the digger and stood at the new well for a long time. Then he rode over to Adeline's property, where she was splitting wood in the last light of the afternoon, with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been splitting her own wood for a long time. He told her the water had come in at 19 feet, clean and steady. Adeline set the maul down and said she was glad. Gideon said he owed her timber for a fence line, and would arrange delivery by the end of the week. Adeline said that was the agreement and that she appreciated it. There was a silence of the kind that happens when something more than the stated transaction has changed hands. And both people know it and neither is quite ready to name it. Gideon said that he had doubted her. Not just that morning when she had knocked on his door, but all day, every hour she spent walking his property. He said he had stood at the fence expecting to be confirmed in what he already believed, that no one unfamiliar with the land could read it better than someone who had spent years on it and failed. Adeline said that was a reasonable thing to believe. She said she had spent a long time learning that water didn't care what you expected of it. It ran where the ground let it run. The only way to find it was to understand the ground's own reasoning, not impose yours on it. She set another piece of wood on the block, and paused before continuing. She said she had found that was true of most things worth finding. Patience wasn't a virtue in the usual sense. It was a method. The dowser and the well driller had both been patient in their way, but they had been patient while waiting for the ground to confirm what they'd already decided. That was a different thing entirely from waiting to understand what the ground was actually trying to say. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He said he had made the same mistake 3 seasons running with the water, and that he was beginning to think he had made it elsewhere too. He said it carefully, the way a man says something he has thought through enough to mean it, but not so far through that it comes out easy. Adeline said that was the harder kind of learning. The kind where you had to watch yourself be wrong in real time, before you could see the full shape of the mistake. She said it without judgment, the same way she said everything, and Gideon found that the absence of triumph in her voice was more persuasive than any argument could have been. A person who had earned the right to say "I told you so," and chose instead to say something useful. That was a thing he had not encountered often enough. He helped her finish the woodpile before he rode home, though neither of them had planned for that. It happened the way useful things often happen, between people who have stopped performing their doubt, and simply started working. The fenced timber arrived Friday. By the following spring, Gideon had asked Adeline's opinion on the placement of a root cellar he was planning on the north end of his property. The first time in 3 years he had asked anyone's opinion on anything to do with the homestead. She told him the north slope would hold moisture too long after snowmelt and that he would be fighting rot within 5 years. She suggested the south-facing rise near the old fence line, and explained why in the same careful, deliberate way she explained everything. He built it where she suggested. Over the years that followed, neighbors throughout the Gallatin Valley came to understand that if you had a practical problem, a drainage question, a soil issue, a structural puzzle on an outbuilding, Adeline Cross Lark was the person to ask, and that Gideon would very likely be standing a few feet behind her while she answered, not because he couldn't speak for himself, but because he had learned that his wife's particular way of approaching a problem, slow, attentive, willing to wait for understanding rather than settle for assumption, produced better outcomes than his own faster, more certain habits, and that watching her work was still, after many years, one of the more reliable ways he had found to see what he himself had been missing. He said once, when someone asked how his wife had come to know so much about reading land and water, that she had learned it the hard way. The same as anyone learns anything that is actually worth knowing. And then he said, which was unusual for a man of his general quietness, that he supposed the more important lesson was one he hadn't learned from books or experience, or the 3 men who had failed before her. He had learned it from a single afternoon spent watching someone refuse to impose her conclusions on a problem that hadn't finished explaining itself yet. The well ran clean and cold for as long as either of them needed it to. I have thought about that story many times since I first heard it told by Prescott's grandson, who had it from his grandfather directly, the neighbor who stood at the fence that October afternoon and watched Adeline Cross read the ground, the way you read a letter from someone you trust, carefully and without deciding ahead of time what it was going to say. The lesson isn't complicated, but I find it takes most of us the better part of a lifetime to really learn it. The fastest way to miss what's true is to decide what's true before you've finished looking. And the person most likely to find what you've been searching for is not always the one who arrives with the most certainty. Sometimes it's the one who arrives willing to listen first. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone read a situation more clearly than you did, simply because they were willing to wait for the answer, instead of arriving with one already in hand? I'd like to know what that looked like for you. And if you're the kind of person who stays for the whole story, there's another one waiting for you when this one ends.